This is very rough, very much work in progress, pretty much abstract speculative grand theory. And so all these disclaimers about it. And I'm going to start with a whole series of starting points which may well at first sight appear to be unrelated, but which I think are related to each other. My first starting point is the sense of entitlement. My second is the politics of BDSM. My third is late Roman slavery. My fourth is the negation of the negation and the reliance on classical antiquity in the bourgeois revolution. My fifth is arguments which the platypus comrades have made in relation to Marxism as the fulfillment as opposed to the negation of liberalism. To start then, the sense of entitlement, I encountered it not that long ago in a completely trivial form, and it just reminded me of something in the 1980s. The trivial form was a guy who drives a 4x4 thinks that anybody driving a less expensive car ought to give way to him. It was sort of, hey, I experienced this. You find it from time to time. You encounter it from time to time, particularly 4x4, so slightly less other expensive cars. But I encountered it in the 1980s. The guy driving a 4x4 the wrong way down a one-way street thought that everybody should give way to him. That's trivial, but in point of fact, the sense of entitlement is also reflected in Cameron's, quote, Notting Hill set or Chipping Norton set, and Cameron's honours list, larger scale, and equally their defeat, not the defeat of the honours list, but the defeat of his set. But equally, actually, in the Blairites and their associated journos, or perhaps we should say the journos and their tame Blairites, outrage at the possibility that they might lose control of the Labour Party. I have to say, this is still a possibility. They've lost control of the top leadership of the Labour Party. They've lost majority among the rank and file membership, but they retain control of the apparat at the moment and of the majority in the PLP. But nonetheless, this possibility, there's such outrage, such unbelievability, etc. It's like Charles I's inability to believe that he could possibly have to make any concessions to his parliament, to a parliament. And I think any number of other examples could be found. It's perfectly possible that the Labour right will in fact regain control through Theresa May calls an early election, Labour Party is smashed, which is the most likely outcome, and then the trade unions turn back to the right on the basis that they think the right are the only people who can win elections. Okay, so the sense of entitlement, in a sense, the question which is posed is, where does the sense of entitlement come from? Where does it come from that people can complain that they are being bullied when the reality is that they have been bullying the people under them for years and years and years, and now the people under them have begun to say, we've had enough of this. Secondly, my second thing, a couple of months ago, somebody, I can't remember whether it was on academia.edu or researchgate.com, which are two of these online repositories where you academics put up work which you've done or abstracts of work or whatever. And somebody asked me to put up a piece that I wrote on the politics of BDSM, that's consensual sadomasochistic sexual practice, in the 1980s, which was published in a collection in the 1980s. and it's been out of print, well, I guess since 1990, the collection, the edited collection. So I thought, hey, I will put this up. And in order to do so, of course, I hadn't got an electronic text of it, because the electronic text of it will have been written in loco script for the Amstrad PCW, so that I scanned it to OCR, and then I had to read through it in order to check for the errors which were introduced by optical character recognition scanning. Now, that meant that I read the damn thing for the first time for 25 years. It was slightly interesting because what this was part of early intersectionality / safe spaces debates. There was an organisation called London Lesbian and Gay Centre, which was set up and funded by the Livingstone-led GLC. And a faction in the movement around that centre argued for the exclusion from the centre of bisexual groups and of lesbian BDSM groups, on the basis that such groups being present prevented the space being a safe space. Yeah. And the arguments which we actually, those of us who were opposed to this line, there was a division in the IMG, of which I was a member at that time, as to whether you should support this line or oppose it. Those of us who were opposed to the line essentially ran with the perfectly reasonable anti-intersectionality arguments, just simply, hey, if you go for this exclusionary politics, it's a politics of purity, and the next stage is, if it's not these people, it's some other people who are impure in some way, and you gradually reduce the movement down to little tiny grains of sand. But for the purposes of actually arguing about the theoretical framework of this, I realized when I wrote this article that you couldn't just follow that line of reasoning about the movement. And it was necessary to engage with the moral and political arguments about the significance of consensual BDSM. I wasn't writing about, somebody else was writing about the bisexuality question. Because in reality, actually, suppose that it could perfectly well be the case that people were seeking to obtain space in the movement for something which was absolutely reactionary. The engagement was with a debate that SAMWAS, on the first of those things, was a West Coast US lesbian BDSM group, wrote a book about the subject, and they were arguing essentially that consensual BDSM is radical debunking. One of the authors said, between the priest's robes, under the priest's robes, under the soldier's uniform, there is a hard-on. And BDSM, by exposing this hard-on, takes the piss out of the priest, the soldier, etc., the army officer, etc., 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 and a whole load of people of this sort. On the other hand, Linden and others' book, polemicising against that, against sadomasochism. I give you the name of one of the authors, Paula Tickley Correct. This is obviously a pseudonym, but it's a sort of nice pseudonym because it's embracing the damnatio of political correctness. Argued that consensual BDSM is merely reenacting and celebrating the forms of domination in society. The conclusion I actually came to in that piece was that consensual BDSM is neither a radical critique of the authority relations in society, nor a mere celebration of the authority relations in society, but that it picks up on and fetishizes and amplifies. Fetishizes is particularly appropriate because BDSM is associated with forms of fetishism, leather, etc., 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 but that it picks up and amplifies and fetishizes forms of the need to take responsibility for your partner, and equally the need to surrender to your partner, which are present in ordinary heterosexual, or for that matter, homosexual sexual relations. So that it also, of course, does in fact contain exploitation, contain etc. But these things are also contained in ordinary heterosex, ordinary homosex. So that the fuss about BDSM from both sides was an overstatement and fetishization of something which, but was nonetheless to some extent interesting. My third, I am in course of reading for my work and also for theory reasons this book, Kyle Harper, Slavery in the Late Roman World. It's a really irritating book. He is polemicizing against the idea that there exists such a thing as a transition from slavery to feudalism. And he is polemicizing against this idea on the basis of explaining the late Roman slave institutions of slavery using marginal utility, Walrasian marginal utility economics. This is not unique. Jairus Banerjee, who is a leftist, came very close to explaining slavery in the late Roman period and saying that there isn't really any difference between slavery and free labour. It's just a spectrum using and very close to using marginal utility economics. Harper is much more irritating than Banerjee because he hammers on and on and on. There is no transition over and over again. But then, having said that, where am I? I'm at page 378 of 520. Hidden behind this polemic is an immensely detailed documentation of the functioning of the slave market in the 4th century, long 4th century, 275 to 425, the social dynamics of slavery, the sexual exploitation of slaves, its normality, the means which slave owners had to use to maintain control, to create a climate of fear, but also a climate of loyalty and dependence among their slaves. And that interrelates, and also the converse of it, that it's the institution of slavery is the extreme of what he characterizes as a culture of honor. So when he's talking about marginalism and the economics of slavery, it's hopeless. But when he's talking about the culture of slavery, it's fascinating. So it's a real contradictory book. That relates to Orlando Patterson's book, Slavery and Social Death. This is an old one. 1982, but one which I think Marxists may well not have read. It's well worth reading. This is a large-scale comparative study of slavery, including classical antiquity, Anglo-Saxon England, Korea, southern United States, Brazil and other parts of Latin America, and so on and so forth. So it's a large-scale sociological comparative study of slavery. And one of the points which Patterson makes, which is my point for this present purpose, is that slavery carries with it an intense fetishization of liberty among the slave owners. Slavery generates this honor culture among the slave owners, which among other things actually makes it rather difficult for slave owners to have stable political institutions, because it's very hard for them to accept that there can be relations of responsibility, authority and subordination among slave owners. Every slave owner has to be a free paterfamilias is the Roman expression, the head of household, who is the slave owner. Also, and secondary in this context, a little book, I cannot now remember the name of the author, but How to Manage Your Slaves is a book about of management advice drawn from the advice to Roman slave owners by various agricultural writers of agricultural management advice, Cato, Columella, and various subsequent people. But it's written, however, in the style of a modern management book. So it's and the author says, I want you to think about, at the end of the day, how much these techniques for managing your slaves are also techniques which might be employed by management in managing employees in modern times. Note in relation to slave owners, I'm just going to flag this up, it's part of why this is wrong, but it's also part of why it's wrong because the classical Marxist writing about slavery is wrong. And he illustrates the point, but actually other people have illustrated the point. Slave holding goes way down the social scale. The slaveholding class includes cobblers who own 2 slaves, one guy to help out in the shop and a woman to do housework.
Slaves could also.
And oh yes, slaves could own slaves. Slaves could own very numerous slaves. One of the fairly early and obscure, one of the early pieces of surviving Roman documentation in Britain is the sale of a slave girl by an imperial slave to another unknown person in London in around 100 AD. So in terms of there is a tendency when we think about classical slavery to imagine it as being like southern USA plantation slavery, where you've got a small number of plantation owners or the latifundistas running the plantations, but actually it's something which is much, much, much more endemic. Herculaneum, they found the citizen voter list. And it turns out that 2/3 of the citizen voter list are ex-slaves. This is a small country town which was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. These points about the obsession with liberty and slavery arose for me as a result of reading Karl Harper's book, part of the way, though it's triggered going further than Karl Harper's book in various different directions. My fourth point was the negation of the negation, and this may seem like a weird... The negation of the negation is a really problematic concept. I'm not going to talk about the negation of the negation as a concept. I'm going to talk about the negation of the negation in a small way, in the way in which it appears in Hegel in the philosophy of right and not in the philosophy of history. In the philosophy of history, Hegel is actually wholly within this concept of the growth of liberty, within a concept of the growth of liberty, and he starts through 3 stages. In Oriental society, according to Hegel, nobody is free except the king or the sultan, etc., etc., etc. It's a very Orientalist, extremely Orientalist book. Then in Greek society, in which he includes Roman society, the slave owners are free, but nobody else is free. And then finally, freedom is instantiated in Germanic Christian society, which through Germanness and Christianity, and Germanic of course includes the whole of the Middle Ages, because he interprets the Middle Ages in terms of the Germanic conquest of former Rome. In Germanic Christian society, freedom takes its modern form, so that it's quite interesting in that sense, but it's not. It's what's interesting in a sense is how far the philosophy of history is from anything which is like. You cannot imagine that Marx is taking his conception of history from this book. But the philosophy of right, on the other hand, the dialectic is a lot more prominent in the philosophy of right than it is in the philosophy of history, and it's actually more prominent than it is in either the logic or the encyclopedia, the long logic or the encyclopedia logic, which have a lot of stuff which is not the dialectic in it. In the philosophy of right, we start with abstractus recht, the abstract law, which is in fact Roman property law. And from abstractus recht, we move through right to wrongdoing as an invasion of right, and through wrongdoing to punishment as a response to the wrongdoing, and through punishment to moralität, which doesn't quite mean morality, it means the Christian concept of conscience as it operated in the Middle Ages. And then moralität in turn is negated successively in the family, which means the rural aristocratic or peasant family, in bürgerliche Gesellschaft, I can't remember if I put that down, civil society, but probably actually means urban society in Hegel. And this in turn in Sittlichkeit, customariness, which is modern liberal constitutionalism. So that we can possibly interpret the dialectic in the philosophy of right as that Sittlichkeit is the negation of abstractus recht. That is to say that modern society as a liberal constitutionalism, that as it were, feudalism is the negation of the liberty of classical antiquity, and modern society is the negation of that negation, and in that sense the return of the liberty of classical antiquity. Okay, put another way, Marx in the 18th Brumaire remarks on the bourgeoisie's need, in order to make its revolution, to dress up in the clothes of classical antiquity, and points to this particularly in relation to the French Revolution and David's painting of the actors in the French Revolution in classical dress, Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul and then as the emperor. But of course this is actually isn't new. The discourse of the Roman Republic was utterly commonplace in the American Revolution, and in fact remains commonplace in American political discourse to this day.
And architecture.
And in the architecture, yeah. There's a classicism, a classicism also in 18th century England, and I pointed here on the board to Junius, who was a polemicist against, taking a Roman name to polemicize against the government of Lord North in the 1760s, 1770s. Cato's letters polemicizing against Walpole's government from the Roman Republican. Cato famously advocated working your slaves until they got seriously old and ill, and then either selling them off if you could find a mark who would be willing to buy a slave who was not obviously unfit to work, or alternatively freeing them if they were obviously unfit to work. Cato's letters, and before Cato's letters, Lucius Junius Brutus, immensely popular tragedy, long since no longer recognised as great literature because it's so Whiggish and revolutionary. Lucius Junius Brutus is the guy who assassinated the last king of Rome, led the creation of the Republic. Okay, so in England, so in the Netherlands, several authors writing on the 17th century have written on the Batavianism of the Dutch Republic, its appeal, the appeal of ideologists for the Dutch Republic to Batavia as the Roman territory, which was the Low Countries. In France, the Protestant revolutionary Francois Hopman, Franco Gallia appeals to France as continuous with the ancient liberty of Gaul, and we have that still present today in the Asterix cartoon books. Actually, we can push further back into medieval Italy. Pisa in the 12th century quite literally set up a carbon copy of the Roman Republican Constitution on the basis of, and announced that they were the Republic of Rome. And there were a whole load of other varieties. So in a sense, the idea of, which is there in a sense, indirectly in the philosophy of right, and is there in a sense in Marx, of capitalism as the negation of feudalism, as the negation of antiquity, and capitalism as the negation of feudalism, the return of ancient liberty, is actually a part of the real thought of capitalist society. Now this relates to, as I said, the Platypus comrades, several of the Platypus comrades have argued for an approach to Marxism as coming as, in a sense, the fulfillment of the unfulfilled promises of liberalism. I'm sort of uncomfortable, I've said this before, I'm sort of uncomfortable with this idea. Partly because it seems to me that the full instantiation of the unfulfilled promises of liberalism is actually the regime of slaveholder liberty and honour culture, and that can be seen in the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, the role of the Virginians, slaveholders, in the Democratic Republican Party of the US in the 1790s, and of the Andrew Jackson anti-bank Democrats, again a southern movement, a southern democracy, southern libertarian democracy of slaveholders against the northern supposed bankocracy. I come finally, therefore, I've spent quite a lot of time talking round, I spent half an hour talking round my various, I guess, points of departure. I'm not going to say an awful lot more, but the point, I think, we have to think about an interrelated but distinct group of ways of looking at society and social order. First off, the underlying issue, practical division of labour among human activities and the material technology that is involved in that. Okay, here actually we can talk fairly simply about slavery, feudalism, capitalism, only not on the terms in which Marx talked about it in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy. Slavery persists and exists in the absence of the wide diffusion of windmills and watermills. The hand mill gives you slavery. That's Marx, I think, is the formulation. The hand mill, anyhow, the hand mill gives you slavery. That is clear. Because if everything has to be ground by hand, there's an immense amount of labour of just grinding grain, which has to be done by slaves. What Marx doesn't say, the windmill and the watermill give you feudalism, I think probably just because he doesn't, the information which makes it available for us to know this. In classical antiquity, there are watermills in Rome to grind the imported grain to supply the grain dole for the Roman citizenry. There are watermills in a few other big cities which can afford us to have state investment in this very expensive technology. Similarly, in terms of roads and bridges, there are military roads, and some of the military roads have bridges on them some of which, God help us, survived to the present day. But these are all state operations. Actually, the grain trade, the great grain ships which trafficked between North Africa and Rome, and in the 4th century between England and the Rhine, and down to the Islamic Revolution between Egypt and Constantinople, were state ships. Okay, the captains smuggled pottery, state ships supplying grain. The captains smuggled pottery and wine and other goods, which then enabled you to have a trade in these other things. But it was basically state grain supplies enabled this. When we get into feudalism, feudalism, we have in Doomsday Book 1066, damn near every goddamn village has a windmill or a watermill. The presence all over the place of windmills and watermills, and through the period between about 800 and 1500, although roads are in very poor condition, more and more and more bridges are built on the basis that feudalism provides a mechanism through toll taking for bridges, whereby you can have bridges which are not public bridges but are invested by the localities. So feudalism, particularly because of the windmill and the watermill, gives you an alleviation of the condition of subordination. Serfs, villeins are less subordinate to their landlords than slaves are to their owners. And the same is true of the peasants of medieval Japan are less subordinate to their landlords than the than slaves are to their owners. So the technology and the division of labour, there is a relationship between the technology, the division of labour and the social relations. In capitalism, we move much more extensively, initially much more extensive use of wind and water machines. My colleague Joshua Getzler worked out that about half of 19th century British textile industry was water-driven rather than steam-driven. That steam-driven only really began to be generalised in this country at a time when actually it was already beginning to be superseded by electric-driven in Germany and the States. Secondly, the form of coordination of the activities which have to be common activities. I've said already the form of the coordination of the activities which have to be common activities in classical antiquity is largely actually state coordination, but to a lesser extent large-scale slave operations. There are large-scale slave operations. There are guys who own latifundia, though most big Roman landowners are not latifundistas who own enormous estates with gangs of slaves, chain gangs of slaves, but people who are landlords who have hundreds and hundreds of tenants, each of whom has 20 or 30 slaves working for him. But mainly the common activities are state activities. In feudalism, the common activities are partly organised by the landlords. So the windmill, the watermill is quite likely to have been put up by the landlord, and then the landlord sets up a feudal duty to grind your grain. It's called suit at mill in English law, the obligation to take your grain to be ground at the lord's mill, and then the lord will take a toll of so much grain. Or it can be a church, or it can be the borough. And so we've got the church collective bodies of the church very extensively organising large-scale common activities. We've got landlords organising them. We've got borough corporations in the interstices organising them. We've actually also got the village itself, which we have, it may be that we're just missing it, because we have in southern Spain evidence of an arbitration award by the governor of the province, in which he settles what is the custom of the division of the water of the valley, of the river which flows through the valley. Maybe there's a whole lot more which we haven't simply got records of local customary arrangements of management of water, of management of fields and so on. But certainly in the Middle Ages, every village has its collective great fields, its collective management of the commons, its collective management of the woods, etc., etc., etc. In capitalism, however, this coordination takes place through the market and through the firm. I draw your attention to a small thing. One of my colleagues came across accidentally a law case from 1639 in which a claim is being made for an account, that accounts should be taken in relation to certain transactions. And the defendant is saying the statute of limitations has run out. This is too old. And in any case, says the defendant, there's no equity here, because if there is a right to account, it's available at common law. There's two branches of law in English law, common law and equity. And the judgment says the statute of limitations doesn't apply to accounts. This is, of course, correct. It's straightforwardly in the statute. And further, there is equity in this case. Why is there equity in this case? Because this is an action brought by a partnership, a firm, and there are 70 partners in joint stock. And shares routinely change hands. And the common law can't handle litigation where all the parties are changing all the time. And if we said there's no remedy for this case, we would destroy trade in the City of London, because most trade in the City of London is conducted by these joint stock firms. This, in this case, a publishing house. It was accounting for a stock of books which was in the hands of the managers. The point is that the joint stock goes back to 1630s in England. That can be said in 1639 that the joint stock firm is utterly routine in London. Engels actually argues in the third volume of Capital that the formation of a general average rate of profit, the idea that every capitalist gets an equal return on capital subscribed, is derived, because Marx gives no explanation of how that would happen, or no satisfactory explanation of how that would happen. Engels argues that that comes from the practice of joint stock in the mining companies and banks of southern Germany in the 1400s, so that the joint stock contributes to the formation of capitalism as such. So money, yes, but money and the firm. So the impersonal exchange through the market, but also interpersonal relations through the firm. Thirdly, it's about ways of thinking social order among humans. Thinking what is the relationship, what ought the relationship to be, what relationships ought to exist among humans. Thinking about the explanation of the relationships among humans. So, in a sense, in classical antiquity, the filius familias, the son who is not emancipated because his father is still alive, his position is modelled on that of a slave. Like a slave, he can't own property, but he can have what's called a peculium, a PECULIUM, a body of savings which his father allows him to have and which he can trade with, he can deal with, and so on and so forth. He's modelled in that sense on the slave, and if he's to be emancipated, the way in which that happens is that the father will sell him to a family friend who then transfers him back to the father, and then he's sold again. If he's sold 3 times, the law says he ceases to be in paternal power. The wife in the Roman Republic is conceived of, the early Roman Republic is conceived of as being in manus, in the hand of her husband. And being in manus of her husband is, again, like slavery. It isn't slavery, he can't sell her, but he has a whole load of powers over her of one sort and another. If the marriage is such that he does not have manus on the terms of the marriage with her, if she remains in his household for the whole year uninterrupted, he will usucapt her, he will acquire her by prescriptive right. He will acquire manus over her. So it came to be the practice in the late Roman Republic that she goes home to her parents for 3 days in the year in order to prevent the husband acquiring her by prescription. So the family relations are modelled on slavery. In fact, exactly the same is true in feudalism. The family relations of feudalism are modelled on, not on slavery, but on serfdom. In serfdom, the lord does not completely own the serf, but he has rights over the serf, and he owes duties to the serf, and the serf owes duties to him. The English terminology for husband and wife in medieval law is baron and femme. The baron is the husband, and the femme is the wife. The baron would be a baron in the sense of a feudal lord. In that relationship, the wife's movables become the property of the husband. The wife's land, the husband has control over, but if he tries to sell it or alienate it, after his death, she can get it back. The wife's movables become the property of the husband to such an extent that in early modern law, if he goes bankrupt, she is allowed to leave the house. She is entitled to such clothes as will keep her decent when she leaves the house, and nothing more. My point simply is that the social relations in general are modelled on the social relations of landlord and tenant, of landlord and serf. If we come to capitalism in this context, capitalism, as I said at the beginning, is not only a system of coordination of our productive activities through the impersonal mechanism of money exchange, but also a system of class order and class power and class exploitation. And just as I said, it's possible to take the Roman, how to manage your slaves. It's possible to take the advice of Roman agronomists to the Roman slave owners of how to manage their slaves and say, hey, this is not that different to management advice for human resources departments. You know? It's important to recognize that that's there. Now, the aspirational classes that we're told Labour ought to be appealing to, the aspirational classes, aspiring people. Aspirational people aspire to escape from the permanent subordination which is involved in wage labour. And they aspire to escape from the permanent subordination which is involved in wage labour, either by climbing the managerial hierarchy within the firm, or by going out on their own into business and making a lot of money in business. This is a perfectly reasonable aspiration, in a sense, and this is also the aspiration, the claim that liberalism makes, is that it rests itself on the relations of impersonal exchange outside the workplace as an alternative to the system of hierarchy which exists within the workplace. But, and here's the kicker, it is not in reality possible for us to live in a world of petty commodity production. Parquet John, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the small baker, is as likely to rip you off. You know, certainly the one monopoly baker in the village is as likely to rip you off, and indeed perhaps more likely to rip you off than Hovis. But we can't go back to such a society, even in late medieval society. I just referred to the joint stock mining companies and joint stock banks of late medieval southern Germany. The joint stock publishing houses of 1630s London. Some productive activities have to be large scale. The mines, for example. The mines have been large scale. They were organised in different ways, but they've been large scale ever since. In point of fact, there's industrial scale copper mining in North Wales in the Bronze Age. And the archaeologists have found from the study of the metallurgy that the copper extracted on an industrial scale in North Wales in the Bronze Age was traded all over Europe. Whether it was traded in the sense of exchange, or whether it was gift exchange or religious redistribution, what the mechanism was is totally invisible to us, because there's no writing until we get into Mycenae and Egypt and the Mesopotamia. But the actual large-scale production in mining goes all the way back there. So there is no period in which you can be without there being some degree of large-scale productive activity which involves a complex coordination of labour. Second, as I said, it's a common illusion that there's a lack of personal dependence in petty commodity production. I referred to the baker is likely to cheat you, but actually also look at Chayanov's work on peasant households in late Tsarist Russia and NEP Russia. Petty commodity production is always patriarchal in structure, because the production is necessarily carried on in the household. There is no separation between the household and the productive centre, the point that Kautsky made, which Mark Mulholland referred to in his presentation yesterday, that it is an emancipatory moment when production is taken out of the household and into the factory. It frees the worker from the tyranny of the household patriarch and makes it possible. You know, the idea that the journeyman tailors of Cambridge, who organised a strike over wages for which they were sued in 1721-22, could have done so. They couldn't have done so if it weren't for the fact that the workplace had been separated from the household. The effect, however, of this, the idea that the market emancipates us of human interdependence, is illusory. Since the idea that the market emancipates us of human interdependence, and indeed of human, I say, interpersonal dependence, is illusory, it isn't just the case that we are still dependent on one another, we're just dependent on one another through the market mechanism and the money mechanism. We are not emancipated from personal interdependence among our humans. since the market does not emancipate us from personal independence among humans, to seek total freedom, complete liberty, for me to seek personal liberty, is to seek dominance over others. The freedom, and again, hey, God help us, it's Kautsky again. I hadn't realised until I got quite close to this point in making up my notes, this is Kautsky again. And constituency and party, which Ben translated. The freedom development of the Member of Parliament is the subordination of the party members to that Member of Parliament. The freedom of the guy who is free to buy a 4x4 is the subordination of other road users to the 4x4 driver. Freedom, then, the liberty, the unqualified pursuit of liberty, and for that matter, the talk of the unqualified pursuit of liberty here, in the philosophy of history, is the freedom of the Germanic peoples through the subordination of the Mediterranean peoples and the Asiatic peoples who are backwards relative to the Germanic peoples. So my suggestion, therefore, which is to take us in a weird way back to, to have dominion, to seek this permanent freedom, is necessary to force subordination on the others. And that means that you have to play the games that Harper talks about slave owners playing, the games which are talked about by How to Manage Your Slaves. You have to play the psychodramas of the master and the subordinate, the lord and the subordinate, because you're pursuing freedom. You're pursuing the subordination of others, unqualified freedom. You're pursuing the subordination of others. So I suggest, therefore, actually, to go back, God help us, to the BDSM stuff, that perhaps we should think about pursuing a culture of switches. So the switch is the guy or girl who is sometimes a top and sometimes a bottom. That we should imagine taking turns at, on the one hand, taking responsibility for others. I am my brother's keeper. The manager, somebody can be elected as manager or elected as shop steward or elected as party leader or MP, and that involves responsibility for and towards other people, responsibility to take decisions. But equally, on the other hand, to be willing, where appropriate, to surrender responsibility to others, to engage in, again, the Kautsky stuff that Mark talked about, the proletarian party, the organisation of a trade union, involves the voluntary surrender of responsibility, the voluntary surrender of freedom in order to achieve things which we can't achieve on our own. This is not to say there isn't a whole load of stuff which we can achieve on our own. And to be honest, actually, I'm not terribly, the point about it marks the issue about intellectual activity is anarchistic. Actually, where we have intellectual activity is anarchistic. You can go and look at it, self-published work on Amazon. Millions and millions of people writing what probably 98% of it is crap, but it doesn't matter that 98% of it is crap. It is still free artistic production that is available, enabled by the anarchistic character of the web. But in the context of the things which we have to do in common, and there are a lot of things which we have to do in common, including the infrastructure which makes possible that anarchistic life of the web, to think in terms of not absolute freedom, but the alternation of responsible power on the one hand and voluntarily accepted subordination on the other hand, that it's not permanent, but that you nonetheless accept that it's there. That's it. Freedmen, similarly, it's a legal obligation. The free person knows, as I said, and I made the point, as I said, that more than a third of the voting population of Herculaneum are freedmen. That actually tells us that the numbers of slaves have to be very significantly higher than just 10% of the Roman population.
But that's an urban area.
I agree that it's in an urban area, but the reality is actually we've got a fair amount of evidence of rural slavery. This guy actually is really useful on working out trying to work out hard numbers for the throughput of slaves in the slave market, for what the evidence there is from census documents, from Egyptian papyri, and so on and so forth on numbers. Moshe, Patricia Crone's book, Slaves on Horseback. Yeah. Essentially, Crone argues that Islamic society has a problem, and the problem is that the ulama never regard the sultan as legitimate. Because the ulama never regard the sultan as legitimate, the only way in which the society can exist as a society is if the army is wholly external. So the army has to be recruited from outside the society. That's the principle which is there in the Mamluks. It's the principle which is there in the Janissaries, who are recruited from the subordinate Christian population. It's the principle which is there in the role of the Kurds, who are also important as the Kurds are the Cossacks of the Ottoman Empire. The Mughals in India constantly recruit horsemen from Central Asia. Yeah. And the calling them slaves, although it has very little, what it's doing is simply to externalize them so that they can't appeal to the imams, to the ulama for protection under Islamic law. It's a state order rather than an economic order. Phil, it's on pre-class society. Yeah, Iroquois. We're talking about society in transition to class society rather than class society. Yeah. I'm not talking about anything other than the internal development of class society. I take it as a world historical defeat, which leads to the creation of class society. I am not talking about the transition, the pre-class society and the transition to class society. The class struggle John referred to, add Pierre Durkheim's Medieval Slavery and Liberation, which is about the class struggle as destroying, the class struggle in the 400s and 500s as destroying Western European, considerable extent destroying Western European slavery. And the Bagaudae, Bagaudae, who were rebels, possibly peasant rebels, possibly slave rebels. The ambiguity about it is Chris Wickham's book, Framing the Early Middle Ages. Wickham argues that in England, I deliberately say in England, in the lowland parts of England, the exploited succeed in overthrowing and destroying completely the system of exploitation in the 400s AD. With the result that the artisans all starve. So nobody's making pottery, bricks, houses bigger than little tiny huts. A few people in a few localities are squatting in increasingly ruinous Roman buildings. And then what happens is that the uplanders come in and take over the upland pastoralists, nomads, as it not nomads proper, but the Welsh who go uphill and down dale, are fighters, and they come in and take over in the west, and the Anglo-Saxon pirates come in and take over in the east. Because if you get rid of the class society altogether, you get rid of not only, hence my point further back, you have to look at the class order not just as a system of social hierarchy, but also as a practical necessity of division of labour. Which, if you destroy the social hierarchy and the division of labour together, all you get is very small-scale warlordism. Very similarly, PDPA in Afghanistan emancipated the peasants from their landlords, but in doing so also emancipated the peasants from the landlords' insurance facilities, the landlords' seed supplies, and created in doing so, therefore, the conditions for collapse into warlordism, which of course the United States assiduously promoted. James, Slave Owner Society in southern USA, George Van Cleve, a slaveholders' union, discusses the self-conscious defense of slavery as a motivation for the American Revolution, as a response to Somerset and Stuart, and as informing the construction of the Constitution of the USA, and in particular the way in which votes are counted, because the free men only could vote, but the slaves were counted as heads for counting the size of the southern constituencies.
Three-fifths of a person.
Yeah,
Counted
exactly, 3/5 of a person. So I think it's wrong to say that a slaveholder consciousness as such is only emerging in the 1830s. Jerry, dying on its feet, well, yes, perhaps in relation to tobacco, but half of that is that tobacco exhausts the soil, and that therefore Virginia tobacco cultivation was exhausting the soil. In sugar, in the Middle Age, in the Caribbean, in Louisiana, in Brazil, slave cultivated sugar was highly profitable. And the evidence is extremely clear, contrary to the standard orthodoxies, that a highly profitable industry, both in the slave trade and slave sugar, was overthrown by mass action, by the combination of the slave revolt in Haiti and the intimidation of MPs in this country to enforce the abolition of the slave trade, which really was a matter of the mobbing, the constant complaints of MPs, of the anti-slavery people mobbing them, and of the unfair boycott of slave-grown sugar and so on. I agree with Jerry that modern neoliberalism constantly talks about liberty and justice, but then actually delivers nothing. What's delivered to Iraq, what's delivered to Syria, what's delivered to Libya, and of course is the same as what was delivered before to Cambodia, to Mozambique, to Angola, to Somalia, to Ethiopia. The problem is that the other side of the coin, in terms of the difference, and this difference is virtually unrelated to this question, this debate. Yeah, there's a difference between CPGB and you about the question, should you call for the victory of the other side? Or do you take a dual defeatist position? And call for the independent action of the proletariat? Donna, people make their own history. I'm sorry, I think this idea is actually already present in Herodotus and Thucydides.
Just the idea, not the real movement.
Well, hey, the creation of Athenian democracy Yeah, and the various forms of stasis in the Greek states and so on and so forth. Yeah, it is people making their own history. It's not, and what goes along with it in the reasonings of classical antiquity, at least of the upper classes in classical antiquity, is an increasing satirical attitude to the gods. An increasing skeptical and satirical attitude to the religion, and in Aristotle, we have this slaveholder idea of the Northerners and the Southerners, which is much more the widespread view. But on the other hand, the Stoics say slavery is an invention of human practice which is contrary to natural law. Yeah. And they have this idea of the cosmopolis. So it extends beyond. What I'm getting at is, I think it's a mistake. Yeah. And I think it's also actually a mistake, in a sense, to imagine that the idea of Christendom and the idea, it's in Islam at a very early stage that you cannot enslave people who are already Muslims. You can hold them as prisoners of war for ransom, but you can't actually enslave them. And then quite quickly, after the appearance of that idea in Islam, the Christians copy it. You cannot enslave fellow Christians. Yeah. And in that context, the enterprise, the idea, in a sense, is there of equality in the face of God. The idea of equality in the face of God, which is there in both Islam and Christianity, means something. Yeah? It's not. It's not empty. So what I'm getting at is, yes, there is novelty in capitalism. It's true. The novelty in capitalism is precisely actually that because the proletariat is separated from the means of production, A, and B, is forced to collaborate in production, precisely because production goes not just in the mines, not just in the ships, not just in the docks and the building sites, beyond the scale of the domestic. The question is posed of communism. The question is posed of the proletariat must collaborate because it's separated from the means of production. But also it must collaborate because capital compels it to collaborate in organised productive activity. That's the novelty in capitalism. It's not, in a sense, it's not the idea of the it's not the idea of liberalism. Yeah? And is the bourgeois society which is separate from and before capitalism? That's just a nonsense. I'm sorry. I know it's a conventional view that the platypus people have. I don't know where exactly it comes from, but it's just a nonsense. There is capitalism. The transition from feudalism to capitalism involves the interpenetration of the emergence of capitalism on the ships, in the mines, on the docks, in late feudalism, with alongside it petty commodity production, which of course petty commodity production is there throughout feudalism for all practical purposes. You know, the guys in Jorvik, in York, as now is, the streets of cobblers and candle makers and so on and so forth in Jorvik is Viking age. So the petty commodity petty production, household petty production is there and is the dominant form of production. There is a profound difference between capitalism and previous forms of production. The petty household production is the dominant form of production in all pre-capitalist societies. It only ceases to be dominant in really actually quite developed capitalism. The point at which capitalism begins to get rid of the small farmer That's it. So I'm going to leave it at that. Yeah.